Our speaker, Loba, they also go by their project name, Flora Pacha. They are a queer Peruvian migrant herbalist, gardener, seed saver, full spectrum birth worker, podcaster, and Patreon content creator. Loba is invested in sharing Abuelita knowledge in hopes that we can build communities that depend on each other and less on imposed systems. Loba is currently based out of SoCal, New Mexico, where they're co-creating the Bloom and Change, a queer land project. So without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to our speaker today.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen, so just give me one tiny second to figure that out. Let's see, are you loading? Give me 1 second. I just want to make sure that it's my internet is very, because I live right outside of Albuquerque. I'm like on the road. I just want to make sure that it's fully loaded on my Canva before I share it. It's like, yes, I know. Okay. No. Okay. Let's put this one there. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Goodness. This is it. So sorry, everyone. Okay. Perfect. Can you all see that? Okay, great. So hi, everyone. My name is Loba, and I am here in Socorro, New Mexico. And today we're going to be talking about a concept that I've been working on for the last almost decade called Abuelita Knowledge. And then also talking about some of the work that I'm doing here in this queer land project called Bloom and Change. I was actually just seeding some, putting some seeds to start. And I'll talk a little bit more about the project too. So my name is Loba, and I changed my project name from La Loba Loca to Flora Pacha very recently, but you can still find me and some of my handles are the same, but right now it's flora.pacha if you'll want to follow me on Instagram. I also have a podcast. If people are at any time bored and want to listen to something, check out my podcast called Wild Weeds Podcast. We're also on Instagram at Wild Weeds Podcast. And it's a pretty awesome podcast because we get to talk about everything from mycelium to asexuality to like queer polyamorous rants, and then also fungi and plants and relationship with greater, like the more than human. So it's a pretty awesome podcast. I mean, I co-host it, but I'm biased, but we have a lot of really awesome people that have presented. So I wanted to ask the question to the audience today, and we were going to do a breakout room, but because we are 60 people, I think we're just going to do a little chat action. So I wanted to see if people, I'm going to open up my chat. Yes, awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel, for writing that down for La Pacha. If anybody here has any idea of what Abuelita Knowledge is, if anybody here wants to share what you think Abuelita Knowledge means on the chat box. I'll give you a couple of seconds for you all to share that. And while you, somebody says pass down knowledge from elders, elder wisdom. No idea, but thinking about the lines of passing down traditions. Perfect. Making me think about how many natural remedies they have knowledge of our ancestors? Yes, I love all of those answers. Traditional knowledge, perfect. So the concept of abuelita knowledge, or how I came up with it, and I'm sure that many people have very similar concepts that probably mean the same thing for them. But for me, abuelita knowledge came when I was in college. I went to UC Berkeley, and then I went to UCLA, and I was taking a class on global sustainability with this very xenophobic English man. He was just like super xenophobic and just like horrendous. And I just, started to realize that even though it's a program for global sustainability, the goal for this program was to teach us how to make the business case for global sustainability, right? Which I think it's something that happens a lot. When we're talking about sustainability, especially like in academia, it's the idea of making it so that businesses kind of buy this idea of global sustainability or whatnot, and like why it's important for them to do it, how they can save money, how they can use that for marketing or whatever, which like make absolutely no sense to me, because capitalism is just the complete opposite of sustainability, right? There's nothing sustainable about capitalism. And I remember that I was really upset. So I just like kept writing on my notebook, and I was like, my grandma could teach a better class on global sustainability than this, xenophobic white cis hetero Englishman. And that's how the concept of Abuelita Knowledge came. And there is an article that I wrote that went viral like about 7 years ago. I got a lot of people contacting me, lots of hate mail, but it was interesting because, that conversation around like abuelita knowledge also as knowledge that is not necessarily considered to be important, right? So it's usually feminized knowledge, is usually elder knowledge, is usually knowledge that is not going to be like written down on books or shared in academia, right? So it's not validated by academia. So I wrote a little kind of description of what abuelita knowledge means to me. Interview I did some years ago, so I'm gonna just read this just very quickly. How I define abuelita knowledge: bodies of knowledge that have been oppressed, stolen, silenced, gone underground, hidden themselves in between spice jars and kitchen cabinets, locked away but remembered and restored when necessary. Abuelita knowledge is understanding and recognizing that there is much knowledge in medicine and our elders, our ancestors, ourselves, and also on just our connection to earth. Abuelita knowledge came to me as a way to resist the current monopoly on education and information sharing. Abuelita knowledge has helped me understand that there are many resources and beds of knowledge left that exist way beyond the current hour classes and white supremacist confines of academia and other deep knowledge generating documenting spaces. So to me, the idea of abuelita knowledge was really like, okay, so how do we actually the yes and talking in the classroom, right? So how do we make that happen? And for me, the first step towards doing that was through, I've always been involved in reproductive justice work. One of the first things that ever politicized me was living in Chile. I'm from Peru, but I grew up in Chile. And Chile back in the day, a couple of years ago, before a couple of years ago, it was any kind of abortion was completely illegal. So like that was the first thing that politicized me when I was really young, just being conscious of like living in a place where abortion was illegal. So reproductive justice was my way into, I guess, learning more about the importance of, like body autonomy, et cetera, et cetera. And when I went to college for my undergrad, my focus was for sterilization of Peruvian indigenous women. So the connection between reproductive justice and, I guess, environmental health and sustainability and like creating those important relationships between us and greater than human creatures, greater than human forces, such as nature itself. It really kind of brought me into like learning about abuelita knowledge and being able to regain a lot of that knowledge through questioning and interviewing and spending time with my elders and my aunts and talking to them about menstruation, birth, postpartum, placentas, and from then it went into plants and into how do people grow plants, like what are the plants, what are the foods that we have been eating, that we have been connecting to for generations, right? So I know where my family comes from. They come from like southern coastal Peru, so they still live there, and I was born there, so there's a lot of strong roots still, especially like traditional like cultural roots in that area. So a lot of conversations with my grandmas and my aunts around just like herbs, food, and birth and how they take care of the children, like postpartum care, et cetera, et cetera. And that was kind of like my journey into learning more and more about Abuelita Knowledge, was like through those conversations that I had with my family. Somebody's asking, how does holistic medicine relate to Abuelita Knowledge? That's a great question. I actually had a talk yesterday and they were asking me, like, what does reproductive justice mean to me? And I was just like, everything, like everything is like so deeply connected, right? But holistic medicine relates to Abuelita Knowledge in the sense that, here, I'll just tell a story. So for instance, in Arequipa, where I'm from, and the part my grandma used to tell me that back in the day, a couple of decades ago, in like their part of town, because it was like a poorer area, there wasn't any access to hospitals or to like regular healthcare, or what we consider to be like regular normal healthcare. So what people would do is that they would go to the señora, who was la señora Teodosa, who was a local healer person in the neighborhood. And a lot of the knowledge that this person carried was information that was passed down like from her own family, like her own research, right? But I think a lot of when I think about Abuelita Knowledge, I also think a lot about autonomy, right? And the ways in which like people have learned how to grow their food, how to take care of themselves, and also how to take care of their community, right? So Abuelita Knowledge to me relates to holistic medicine because it is about like passed down knowledge, and a lot of times it's passed down knowledge that like people needed to survive or that need to survive because they're not getting those needs met like through the system or through the state, right? So they're kind of like in a way like survival stories, survival narratives, survival like first aid knowledge, right? That people need to have in order um, to take care of themselves and their community. Emily says, makes me think about how seeds or plants also come from the ovary of the flower and how growing plants itself is intertwined in reproduction. Oh, definitely. I mean, I always, and like that's I think that's the beauty of all of these ideas and concepts that people have been working on for so long. Like even like reproductive justice as a concept, it was created by Black women only like a decade, 2 decades ago. Like that reproductive justice as a concept has come up, but it's intertwined with everything, because when you're talking about reproductive justice, you're talking about like prisons prisons must be obsolete because people need to be able to parent their kids, or abortion needs to be completely available because reproductive justice means also like accessing abortion if people want to, when they want to, for free, right? But it also means having access to clean water, clean soil. It also means having access to food, right? To like land to grow food in, right? So there's just so many connections between like reproduction and also the environment, which is one of the issues why we see so much like reproductive like what's it called environmental racism, right? So places in which there is a lot of black folks, indigenous folks, like migrant low income people, those areas specifically being hit horribly by like companies that like don't care if they're just polluting the entire soil, the entire that entire area where low income communities, most racialized communities live in, right? And that also has a huge impact on people's like reproductive lives, right? Endometriosis, it's like a major issue when folks live in areas that are like highly that are toxic, basically, right? So everything is definitely deeply interconnected, and I think that's also why for me it was so easy to make that connection between getting into Abuelita Knowledge and learning about menstruation and reproductive health, and why not. And then moving into growing plants, which is what I'm doing now. Like I used to be a midwife student, and I used to be very much involved in like doula work and menstrual education work, which I still do. But my goal right now is to grow up food and medicine. So I've been working a lot on like growing food and medicine. That's kind of what I'm doing right now. Let me go to the next one. And I wanted to talk about this concept of chakra. So the work that I'm doing right now is working with land, doing land-based work. And what Emily described, it kind of, describes how I moved from talking about more like, like doing my work most in like reproductive justice work into doing food sovereignty and like food justice work. There is a concept in where I'm from, and like it's a concept that a lot of people in the Andean region probably know, which is a chakra or a chakra. Another word for this that some people that from Central America, from Mexico, we know is a milpa, right? So they're basically your growing spaces, but they are more than just growing spaces. Usually when we say chakra or chakra or growing space, we're also talking about a place in which you're growing alongside plants. So the way that we usually think about, I mean, I'm sure people here probably already know better, right? But the way that society usually thinks about places in which there's food production or where, people grow food or food is grown, those are just like, whatever, like your farm, right? Your regular farm, the places that you just grow food. But there's not really a deep understanding about the connections that we as humans make with plants, that we as humans have with, with the land, with the water that we're using. Like that lack of understanding of how we're deeply interconnected with like the plants we grow, with the soil, with the water, is something that is definitely lacking. And people might have heard about regenerative farming and all that, or organic farming or certified organic farming, which is just such a wild it's such a wild concept, because that's the way people grow traditionally, right? Like traditionally people don't grow gmo seeds, right? Traditionally people don't go and spray pesticides in their food. Like traditionally people don't grow monocropping, like don't monocropping means when you're just growing one type of food or herb. And you're not having diversity, which is super important for the health of the soil, but also of insects and other animals that depend on flowers, pollination, food, etc. So the idea of chakra is a place in which you're in communion with the plants that you're growing and with the soil that you're growing. So when you're thinking about your growing space, the places that you're growing food, in a way that it's about interconnection and not just extraction, which is something that like we definitely, like in the West, the way that we think about everything and anything is through a very extractivist lens, right? So we're like extracting resources, we're extracting food, we're just getting. But chakra is a concept that talks about like the place that you're growing food, but you are also growing alongside your food. Therefore, you're definitely more conscious about what you're putting in your soil, what you're putting, in the water, like how you're treating your plants, what seeds you're growing, because it's just, thinking about like a cyclical way in which you're giving something and then you're getting something back in return. So people, when we have chakras and when we take care of our growing spaces in that way, we usually do, we feed the earth, right? We ask permission, we do lots of gifts to the earth so we can have lots of food and lots of medicine back, but also so we can provide flowers for pollinators, right? So we're not just thinking about like our humanity and like how important it is for us to have food, but also how do we like have diverse growing spaces in which we're also providing food for the birds, for the bees, for like other insects, etc. So those are just some pictures, and I always show this ones because I just moved here to Soco, New Mexico 7 months ago. But this ones are back when I lived in Los Angeles, right? So I think lots of times people are like, oh my God, growing plants in Los Angeles is impossible. But I always like to show these pictures because I grew all of this in Los Angeles, dirty, extremely like compacted, horrendous soil, right? Like that city, and like I think a lot of cities, right? Like the health of the soil is just so sad. But we can heal the soil, right? And I think that's something that it's so beautiful about growing plants and like I guess my journey with growing plants and trying to implement all of this ideas about like sustainability and like thinking about relations. It's been beautiful because you start realizing that we can heal soil so easily, like even just like a small patch of soil. On the very left, this is one of my first kind of like big gardens that I ever made years and years and years ago. It's mostly on recycled, what's it called? The cars, recycled tires. You can see them there. So I had no money, and there was like a tire shop down the road where we lived. So we just went there and we just got a bunch of this and we just carried them back home. We like rolled them back home because we also didn't have a car. So it was like super wild, but we made it happen. We had like honestly, this right here, it's so many different types of plants in a very small space. We were able to grow lots of native California plants, but also like herbs and food. And it started in a very small space. Like if you see around, it's like cement, and like there was some sand that a lot of the local cats were using as cat litter. And we made it into this like huge, beautiful growing space. Here in the middle, it's me in between a bunch of popcorn corn. After we lived here, we moved into this apartment space. In the front, there was just like dirt, and people never did anything with it. So I asked the landlord and she let me grow a bunch of corn. I grew so many plants. There are native plants and non-native plants, and I moved out, but there's still a bunch of plants were left behind that were growing. So like that was the cool thing. That's the cool thing about also growing in a way that is regenerative, and in a way that you're also thinking about, what makes sense to grow in that specific area is that you can leave, you can move, and you still leave all of these plants behind, which I think, that's kind of the point about chapter, or like that's also just the point that like a goal that I feel like all of us as humans should think about, like the importance of thinking beyond just like our own personal enjoyment. Like I live here in New Mexico now, and I'm planting so many trees, and they're so little, right? And they're probably when I leave, because I'm probably gonna leave in a decade, they're gonna be like what, maybe like 4 feet tall or 3 feet tall. Like I'm never gonna be able to enjoy the shade or the fruits, right? But just really thinking about, like people are gonna come next, but also not just the people, but also like the birds that are going to eat those peaches, in like 10 years from now or 5 years from now, right? So kind of thinking also about the generations to come and like, like the future more than just like our immediate satisfaction. And then on the very right, this is my last space that I lived in Los Angeles. This used to be like a parking lot. The person that lived there before would park her car. The soil was so bad. It was like really, really hard to work with that soil. But in like this right here, it's probably like 4 months in. Like I grew, like I put all my energy into my garden because that's like basically like the only thing that I care about. So I had a bunch of seedlings, and this were already started, and I made like a whole little jungle forest there. So I always like to encourage people to grow their own food and stuff. Let me see if people have some questions I saw. How do you heal the soil? There's many, many, many ways. Let me see what's the next slide, because I think this one might talk about it. Okay. Okay. So let me see what pictures I have. There's many ways to heal soil. Honestly, sometimes you just start growing stuff and you can heal the soil. Like you can, I've literally done stuff like you just pick a random spot in the area that you're at, and then just like start growing some sunflowers, throw a bunch of amaranth seeds, like plants that grow very easily, like amaranth, sunflowers. Those are really good to just kind of like throw in the soil, water a little bit, and then little by little. It's so wild how starting a farm or starting a garden works, because like sometimes you have bare land. Like for example, these are pictures of like what we're working with right here in SoCo, New Mexico. I have to update them because now I have a bunch of plants growing. But like it's very arid here. We live in like 7,000 altitude, 7,000 feet out, something like that, 7,000 something altitude. It's very high. It's like the high desert. So it's very, very, very dry, right? And as you can see, like a lot of it, I mean, we have a lot of, we're kind of at the bottom of a juniper and pine pinon, like forest. We're like at the bottom of the mountain. And you can, like I'm growing all types of stuff, right? So I think that it's been really hard to work with the soil because I don't think people have grown here for a very, very, very long time. Moriarty, which is the city that I live in, is a very settler city. There's a bunch of indigenous folks to here, to New Mexico, that have worked, I mean, I've just seen some like desert oasis, like a lot of like beautiful desert, like indigenous desert farming that happens, because people have been working with, with their land and their territories forever. Um, Somebody's saying, clarify, what is it to be healed? How to, do you mean, somebody's asking, can you please clarify what is it to be healed? I'm not very knowledgeable in this field yet. Can you like heal soil? Okay, so what do I mean when I say healing soil? Like it's kind of hard to explain. Actually, let me just take a picture. Let me just show you something. Okay, so for example, in this picture in the middle, this soil, okay, what's wrong with it? So it depends. So there's soil sometimes that is like extremely compacted. Sometimes like soil gets very compacted when there is, for instance, like construction, or you have cars that park in that area. So what happened on the very right picture, that specific area of dirt, the person that lived there before would park her car on there, right? So what happens is that if you keep having like something heavy go on top of soil, it gets compacted. So when the soil is very compacted, it's very hard for plants to grow, because roots need some type of air ventilation, to be able to grow, right? So one of the big issues that we have right now in the world is that a lot of our soils are either being super compacted or contaminated. The rates of soil being just completely and horrendously like polluted, it's horrendous, right? So you can do a lot of damage to the soil by either not being careful of how you're where you're parking your car, but also if you're spraying a lot of sprays within your plants, that stays in the soil. And a lot of times, like, people don't understand, for example, with Roundup, right? It's a huge issue because people sometimes just like see a weed or see a, I don't know, like a dandelion, and then they go and then they start spraying a bunch of Roundup or any other types of chemicals. Those chemicals stay in the soil. So a healthy soil will be a soil that is vibrant, that has a lot of vitality, a soil that you can grow things in. And you can heal soil by planting specific plants that kind of clear out toxins and clear out chemicals from the soil. You can also use like mushroom harvesting, like growing mushrooms in your gardens to also do that. There has been actually beautiful research around like using mushrooms to clear out nuclear waste, or in the case of like of war create they create a bunch of like just trash and like basically trash soil. And people have been doing a lot of beautiful research around clearing nuclear waste, for example, using mushrooms, right? So that would be another way of clearing of healing soil. So basically, I say that healing soil to me would mean working with soil, whether it's compacted or whether it's been sprayed on, or whether it's been not treated nicely by humans, and through planting somebody. So basically, the soil is sad because it's meant to facilitate life, and it's being treated like dirt, or I guess less than dirt. Yeah, exactly. So, and I mean, this is kind of like when I say healing soil, it might not make that much sense, but I guess like an alternative to that would be regenerating soil, right? Or like making so that soil can grow life again. But it is kind of like facilitating life and like supporting that. And I always tell people that it's important for all of us to do that, even if folks are like, well, I don't have land, I only live in this apartment, like what can I do? I'm like, even if you have like a pot of soil and you're growing something, like I think the action of being involved in facilitating life the action of being involved in like taking care of something, I think is super, super, super important, because, you know, when the revolution happens in the future, right, we all should know how to grow plants, how to grow food, and how to heal soil. Yeah, definitely small gardens for the win. You know, I used to have small spaces to grow in, and even that has been like a great like training opportunity, right? Because I have so many years of like growing in small spaces, growing, you know, very low resource. Like I don't use, you know, all of the stuff that you go into like a garden store and you just like, you know, get a bunch of stuff to like make your stuff grow. Like I'm very low resource gardener. So then when I moved here to this farm, I'm able to apply all of those concepts into, you know, like a bigger area. Of course, thank you for asking what healing soil means. I feel like sometimes I forget that not everybody knows what that means. So my queer land project called Bloom and Change. I am the co-founder. My partner is the other person that is working and living here. So we are a farm based in Soco, New Mexico, and what is traditional Tona Pueblo land. And the idea with the project, and we just started like 7 months ago, and like starting a farm during a pandemic, and you know, like it's just been really wild. But the goal with this project, at least for me, we have kind of we separated the project in two, because Carino, who's my partner, is working more on creating like a queer petting zoo so that people can kind of, you know, like those piggies in the middle, that, you know, just like creating like a space so that specifically queer and trans people can access to like pet animals and like feed them, right? And to kind of get their little, you know, like animal relation healing situation going. And then on my end, I'm trying to well, I'm not trying because I'm doing it. I'm doing a farm, and the way that I want it to work is that I want to produce enough food so I can trade with other farmers, enough herbal plants, like herbal medicine, so I can make herbal medicine because I'm an herbalist too. But then to help that fund me so that I can grow a bunch of food, extra food that I'm able to just give away. So my goal is to just give away free food, and I hope that I can do that this year. And you know, while we have been building this project and this farm, there's been many people that have come out and helped. So the goal is to also make it into like a learning farm so that people are able to come over. We have friends that come over for the weekend or just for one day, and we, you know, we just like do it from the bottom up. We just kind of like, I mean, on the very right, that's a picture of like the first beds we worked on, and then on the left we set up those fences, and I should probably have more images to like update, you know, to update what we've been doing. But it's basically been pretty awesome. We've planted over 100 native trees and native plants, and I'm working with about a quarter of an acre, so that's where I'm growing the food and the herbs. And my goal is to be able to have like a good amount of it so I can give them out to, you know, I'm still trying to figure out who I'm going to be funneling that food to. Definitely all mutual aid groups here, and like, you know, just central New Mexico. And then my partner is working on, you know, piggy and like queer animal pet zoo. But also they want to do like a lending library so that other queer and trans people can access gear for camping and be able to access nature in that way. And the reason why we wanted to make the Bloom and Change farm happen is because we saw that a lot of people in our community, especially queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color folks, didn't have access to nature, right? Like it's really like, to start, it's really hard sometimes for folks to be able to like even leave their homes, right? So being able to like access a space for folks to you know, come through, that it's safer than other places, and to learn how to build, like we did this little shed right here. We did a lot of building in there, farming, right? So building and farming are usually very like white and like white cis hetero dominated spaces, right? So providing those, I guess, like those, you know, those like safer spaces to learn um, has been really sweet. We've met a lot of awesome people. I have 4 minutes. If people have any questions, I'm gonna go ahead and just move to the last slides in case people want any book recommendations. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask them on the chat. Um, oh, I have a little, okay, perfect. Yeah, I'll take some questions. So if you want to write out your questions while I just read some of the cool reads and book recommendations, because like sometimes people are always like, oh, I want to know what I should read. Can soil carry trauma? I think so. I mean, I don't know if there's any research that will say that yes or no, but I definitely think it does, right? And that's why sometimes I don't want to get to like, like spirits and everything, but that's why sometimes, like, especially like depending on what culture you come from, for instance, like, I don't know, when we go into cemeteries, like I love going to my local cemetery when I'm in Peru because I have a lot of family there. People will oh, okay, Rachel is saying can start Q&A in about 10 minutes. Okay, perfect. Let me just answer this one because somebody just sent it to me, so I'll just answer it now. But yeah, so for example, in where I'm from, like when you're in a cemetery, like you're not allowed to take anything, because if you take something then your soul can be grabbed, right? So even just like the soil carries, like, the people that have been buried there, so that if you're, taking something without giving anything back, then the earth can grab your soul. So there's a lot of, I guess it's very cultural, but I would say that I definitely think that soil can carry trauma. And that's also why I think it's so important for us to take care of soil in, like, in good ways, right? So I'm not I grew up Catholic because that's kind of like the colonizer religion that got to my region. But I always say that I only kneel for earth and for my puppies, you know what I mean? To feed other animals and to tend for plants and to seed. That's the only thing I kneel for, right? So like that's the only kind of like religious, like in Catholicism, like you kneel for Jesus or God or something. I don't know what, but when you're in church, they make you kneel, right? So for me, like my religion or my spiritual practice is very much earth based, and a lot of times in the Andean region, a lot of people have very earth-centered religion. So what we do is we give lots of thanks. We like treat earth like in a way that it's kind of like your mom, right? I'm not saying that moms are great, but I guess that to me a great example of an awesome mom is earth because it's always feeding us and it's always protecting us and it's always holding us up. But definitely there's a lot of people that would say that yes, soil can totally carry trauma. And that's why you can do different types of offerings too, right? Especially if you're going into like sacred areas, like sacred areas for other people. Like it's so important to always ask for permission, and to also sometimes carry some gifts, which can be like some food, like some kernels of corn or some tobacco, or sometimes hair or water, because soil can totally carry lots of things, right? So making sure that we're asking permission, it's super important. So some cool reads that I wanted to share with y'all if people are interested in learning more. On this very left, this is a really beautiful book that it's in Spanish. I don't know if it's been translated. But it basically is a beautiful book that translates to Criándonos. It's like growing between plants and men. I think in humans, so like growing between plants and humans. And it's a beautiful book on traditional like technologies, traditional ancestral agricultural technologies of the Chindaypuquio area, which is in Cusco. And it's a beautiful book, recollection of ways in which like people take care of their chakras, of their land, of their growing spaces in that specific area, which I think it's just, especially if you're interested not only on growing plants, even if you're not like trying to be a farmer or whatever, but even just like, at least to me, something that has been super, super useful has been just like relearning, like cyclical ways of thinking, cyclical ways of being, right? Especially in the context that we live in, which is like capitalism, white supremacy, right? In which everything, it's like a line that just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing, and there's no end to it, right? Just like this exponential growth, right? And everything, right? It's super linear and it's always like production, production, production. But in reality, when we disrupt that and we realize that we actually, like, that's completely inhuman, like we cannot live in that way, right? That we live in cyclical ways, like we live in we like that we need to return into this idea of, thinking about cycles, thinking about relations, thinking about ways in which like our actions impact other people, etc. I think that learning more about agricultural traditional knowledge can be super helpful towards like relearning that. And in the middle, this is called DIY Mushroom Cultivation by Abuelita. It's a really awesome book. I didn't get to talk too much about mushrooms and fungi, so I guess I'm going to talk about it now. But if people are interested in learning more about soil regeneration and soil health, and just really cool stuff, definitely like learn more about mycology, right? So I've been super into mycology and fungi lately, because I think that mushrooms and fungi are the future. I really, really think that fungi are the future. There's just so much beautiful stuff that we can learn, even from growing mushrooms or learning about mushrooms. I already mentioned like the ways in which people have been doing really cool research around how to work with mushrooms to remediate soil, to remediate not only soil, but to remediate like literal nuclear waste stuff, right? So like, that's major, right? That's huge. Fungi are so awesome, especially this last year. I'm hoping that most people here know about mutual aid and like the importance of like relearning this networks of care, etc. Like the way that mycelium works, the way that fungi works, is very similar to networks of care, like radical networks of care, like mutual aid. It's very decentralized, right? Like the way that mycelium grows is very decentralized. There's no hierarchy. It's very horizontal. It's very decentralized. It's just like, you have a bunch of stuff, just a bunch of mushrooms popping up here, then over here. It's very much about decentralizing and like destroying this, like destroying these hierarchies that we have been built in our heads. Fungi, just something really cute just to finish. I'm not talking about mushrooms because I can go on talking about fungi and mushrooms for a long time, but there is been, yes, there is where it's at, definitely. Cool stuff of fungi. Like for instance, if you have a whole forest, right, and there's like fungi growing in between the tree roots, etc., which it's huge. Like there's people that say that without fungi, like we wouldn't be here, right? Like the only reason why we have access to plants in the soil, like on Earth, it's because of like fungi relationships that were created with the roots of specific plants, etc. A lot of the plants that we eat, that we depend on for food, very much depend on fungi. There's been a bunch of research papers that show that fungi, specifically mycorrhizal fungi, allow plants and trees to talk to each other. Definitely. So what I was talking about earlier, if you have like a forest, right? Like it's a forest, and you have trees on the very, very end of the forest that are experiencing like a pest, right? Let's say that something is attacking them, right? They, through fungi, can communicate with the other side of the forest, and like fungi kind of like carries this message and tells this other side of the forest, hey, this other side of the forest is experiencing, like it's being attacked by whatever X, Y, and Z. So that that communication allows for this trees that haven't been touched yet to produce like specific like chemicals so that they are prepared for that pest to get to them, right? There's also been research about how fungi can carry water. So like if there is areas of the forest or areas or of even a farm in which there is less water, fungi can literally like move nutrients and water to that side, right? So it's this idea of like sharing and understanding that if we have a lot of resources, we can share that with other people, which I think is like so beautiful and speaks so much about mutual aid, right? And like sharing resources, sending information, sharing information, and understanding that that's the only way that like we can live, like through sharing information and sharing resources. Mushrooms research team on campus. Perfect. There you go for folks that want to learn more. It seems like people here are very, very into fungi and mushrooms. So this book, The DIY Mushroom Cultivation, I really like it. I also really appreciate that Abuelita Knowledge, who I think is half Peruvian, actually mentions like the indigenous lands that he's on, which is super rare for mushroom stuff. I feel like fungi in general here in the US has been just kind of colonized, and sometimes people are really into mushrooms, but sometimes they forget that we're on stolen land and all that. So I really like it and I really appreciate it that he named that. Lots of colonial practices when it comes to like land tending, it's so wild because I've been in LA and now I'm here in New Mexico, and I'm part of a lot of, like Facebook groups of like native plants and why not. And people love to talk about native plants, but they never talk about native people, like never, not even mention native people, right? So yeah, especially when it comes to like agriculture and mycology, I feel like it's important to push that. And on the very, very right, I have a big cartel, which you can access a bunch of my online classes. I'm going to leave that at the end. So if people are interested in learning more, I have a bunch of super affordable online classes. This one specifically is on Andean medicine, which means like medicine from the Andean region. I have a Patreon, which I have almost 4 years of content creation. You can access for as little as $1 a month. So I'm going to leave that too. Okay, somebody's saying, somebody sent me a direct message. So I'm gonna just read it to see if there's a question in there. Maybe I'm gonna read that at the end since I just want to go through this. I'm so sorry. I have ADHD, so it's really hard for me to focus. Focus on what I'm doing all the time. It's all good. No worries, no worries. The person that sent me the message, don't worry, I'll read it afterwards. So yeah, so and then here in the native way, I wanted to include our all in California. So this is a really beautiful book. It's just so beautiful. It's written by the Chair Collective, which is an Elder Native California collective. And this book focuses on cooking with native California plants. It's not necessarily like, hey, let's go wildcraft all of this endangered native California flora, but it's good because I think it makes maybe you're able to identify and you're able to be like, oh, like that is an elderberry. Oh wow, that is white sage. Oh, that's black sage. This is how people have been and continue to work with this plant, right? So it's a beautiful book, especially we are in so-called California to access. And then on the very right, this is a beautiful book written by a Black woman, and it's about in like traditional African American healing, which I think is super important for non-Black people to understand that like a lot of the plants are used even in Western herbalism, and even just some of the agricultural technologies that we have is because of Black people, African folks. A great example would be CSAs, right? So like all those boxes that we sometimes go and get at the farmers market or in different farms, like that was technology. That's Black agricultural technology. So I always think it's super important, and it's very insightful. This book is beautiful. I haven't finished it yet, but I've been reading it for a year now, and it's like I always just pick it up and just read a little bit and then move on and just kind of like go back to it, etc. It's a beautiful book. And yes, I have a bunch of online classes. I already said that. But yes, so you can, before I go into Q&A, I'll just share very briefly some of my links. So this one doesn't exist anymore. Now it's florapacha.com. And somebody asked what a patron is. So my patron is right here, patreon.com/Loba. And Patreon is basically a site where it's kind of like a content creation site. So I have a bunch of content from like soil blocking, like abortion doula trainings, to runs on medicine making, mushroom medicine making, like a bunch of stuff that I've been creating for the past 4 years. So I put everything there. So you're able to access it if you like, if you pledge a certain amount of money, you're able to access something. So it's as little as $4 or $10 a year. And that's my Patreon. And then my Big Cartel is this one right here, which I actually think this is wrong. I think it's lalobaloca.bigcartel.com. I don't know why I wrote that. But you can access some of my online classes there too. And let's see if people have any questions. Let me see. I'm gonna read one of the comments that somebody sent me. I'm just to post this because it's a big virtual, but this with you. I was raised to be Catholic Christian, but I just have always seen nature as the most sacred thing, for like a better term. that we ought to be treating with utmost respect, for giving us the ability to live a beautiful life. Yeah, and definitely. And I think that a lot of, even just like Christianity and capitalism, like they have roots on paganism, right? But I'm like, can we just all be pagans? Like forget about, colonial religions. But yeah, I guess that's another conversation for another day. And yeah, somebody's saying our knowledge of indigenous people should be directly from them. Definitely, because that's also a huge issue, right? There is like, and even like in herbalism, like I've encountered a lot of like horrendous practices in which like herbalists are like, oh, let's make medicine with like indigenous plants, native plants, and it's like, well, where are the native people? Like, where's your permission to use those sacred plants? Like, so there's just, even in the healing community, it's a huge thing. Yeah, so some people are describing what Patreon is. Yeah. Perfect. So if y'all have any last minute questions, somebody says, how do you deal with hate and oppression? Oh my goodness. It's a hard one. I don't know. Hate towards me, or like me being hateful to somebody else. But I guess, yeah, so how do I deal with hate and oppression? I don't know. I feel like that's something that we learn, right? Like since you're very little and you live in this world, other systems that are set up to just make you feel bad, to make you literally feel sick, to, like, yeah. So I think it's just something that you deal with and you make the most out of it. I think that for me, something that has been really helpful, is really like, and creatures have been like a saving grace, basically. I For me at least, like I understand my relationship to land, to plants, to like the piggies that are that live here, like to my puppies, in a way that it's like as important or even more important than other human connections. So I think that for me, like being able to connect and to like feel like ultimate love, with like the non-human kind, has been so important with dealing and healing hate and oppression. And just also understanding that a lot of that hate and oppression comes from systems that are going to be destroyed. Like we're going to destroy them because they do not make sense. Like they're completely unnatural. So I think that for me is just like remembering, right, that there's other ways in which we're gonna have to learn how to live, to be able to even just be alive on the earth, right? We're gonna have to relearn so much stuff to be able to continue being like on earth. So, just hoping that hate and oppression and those systems that have been built up get composted. I guess that would be my answer. But yeah, and I don't think there's any more questions. So, and somebody says, I believe that God is meant to be a concept of Mother Nature. I agree. Definitely, definitely. And also, whenever people think about God, at least my mom, she would always say like, oh, it's everything. And I was like, what does that mean? It's everything, but I guess for me, I would translate it to creatrix or to goddess, right? To like a creating force. Oh, gemcorn. Mm-hmm. Somebody say, oh, I'm just like looking at all of the direct messages that are going directed to me, so I'm gonna share them as I read them. My mom has been getting really into spirituality, herbalism, and indigenous culture, so I directed her to a ton of resources. So thanks for making stuff accessible. Awesome. Yes, and and like that's a cute thing, right? Because sometimes like people can be way older and like get back into their roots, which I think is like so powerful when that happens. Tips for growing gem corn. I feel like, yeah, I mean, I have the gem corn that my friend grew with me, because like we shared seeds. It was like pretty small. So I think it also depends on, maybe it can depend on so much, like did I get enough water, um what kind of seed was it, maybe mixed in with like a popcorn seed, which are usually smaller. So I think it would depend on a lot of things. I would have to see like how you grow your corn to be able to get examples. But I personally love whenever my corn comes out all weird and stuff. I'm just like, I always appreciate it regardless. I love corn. yeah, I'm gonna actually be doing a class on corn growing, sliding scale, starting like at $10. So I'm gonna post it in my Instagram. So if people want to follow me on Instagram too, to be Pacha Flora, or is it Flora Pacha? Let me check that. I always forget the name. But yeah, so people want to learn more about growing corn, I'm definitely gonna be doing that. And my Instagram is Flora Pacha, and I'm trying to do like a sliding scale class on growing corn, because it is definitely one of those foods, like traditional foods that my family has been growing forever. So I always love corn. Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening to me for almost an hour. I appreciate it. Oh, perfect. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I still, if people want to have any questions, I'll be here. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and also if folks do want to take the time, if anything from Loba's presentation stood out to you that you want to mention, you can put it in the chat or you can bring it up now in conversation, because we probably have about 10 minutes left of just conversation if we want to.
I just wait and see. Maybe people are typing something up. Sometimes it takes a while to type.
Loba, I just have a kind of a broad question that I was thinking about as you were giving your presentation. So you talked about how especially if people are not careful about how they treat these areas, treat the soil, they could potentially like poison and damage it, and that has lasting effects. So like, let me think about how to word this. What do you think the future looks like if we do, have more, if we're more attentive and if we're actually being mindful of being like stewards of the soil, even in, our rural or in our urban areas? Like, what do you think that looks like if we do, like, I guess, like collectively incorporate more of like mindfulness for that?
No, I mean, it's just so complicated because I always feel that, I don't know. And like I've always, and it's always hard because I'm always like looking at articles, just like, all of this like super apocalyptic, like the world's gonna end. Like we're literally like there's no way we can return back into like, regenerative anything, because like we're literally like sinking. We're like in a boat, like a sinking boat type of thing, right? And it's always complicated because it's so easy to feel hopeless, right? Also, like what our own individual, like let's say like if 100 of us start doing something, like what is that going to be? Is that going to have create an actual impact when we have like huge as corporations that are destroying like topsoil and destroying water like resources, like in a level that is just like so ridiculous, right? Like you can that's the thing that I'm always just like super amazed at, like how long it takes to build, for example, topsoil, and how easily we can destroy it by just spraying something on it, right? So I think that if all of us were to get on the team of, like healing earth and treating resources in a way that is respectful and in a way that it makes sense, I think that we can do a lot. But I'm always just like in the back of my head, like, but literally like the corporations are the ones that need to be like fully destroyed for this to happen. Right? Like it just, and I always tell people like, that's not to say that like we shouldn't do anything, because I think that all of us need, like if we're gonna think about our future, all of us need to relearn how to behave, like how to be human, like human beings, like how to be animals, basically, right? Like besides this idea of like anthropocentrism, in which like humanity is at the center of it, and like we create like extremely like human-centered cities and human-centered ways of living without really like understanding that, you know, like we're just one tiny little piece of the puzzle that is called, you know, like the ecosystem. um I think we can create a change, and hopefully we can create at least like the consciousness that is going to be needed for us to be able to even have a future. Because even if we're not able to stop all the corporations from doing all the horrible stuff, you know, like how do we even like think about like surviving? How do we even think about like what farming is going to look like in 10 years from now, like what life is going to look like in 10 years from now, right? So I think it's important. I think we have to do it, but I feel like in the back of my head I'm always like, is it going to be enough? Is it going to be enough? Like, you know, is that even enough? Like what else do we need to do? And I think like for me ultimately I'm just like really amazed at how many people do not care or do not think that global warming is real. Like even I have friends that are like, oh yeah, global warming is real, right? They believe in it, but like they're not making any changes in their lives. And by changing their life, I don't mean like, you know, just go and get some like reusable sippy cup or something, right? It's like more like, okay, so what, like, are you growing food? Are you taking care of seeds? Like, you know, like, are you like pooping in a composting toilet? Like, what are you doing? You know, like, are you reusing your bath water and making, you know, and growing some plants without water? Like, how are we doing that? And especially like, you know, I used to live in Los Angeles, which is like so wild how like even just like California and like big city California thinking is it's just so trippy, right? It's like so trippy. Like the entire city is on fire and people are like, you know, partying or like, you know, watering lawns. Like there's no water and people are like, oh, let me just have a huge lawn. Of course, rich people, right? Let me have a huge lawn of green grass, like in the middle of like what? Like a literal like environmental disaster in which like cities like LA needs to like, you know, steal water from like other parts of the country, not even in California, right? Like LA is like stealing water from like other parts of the country to be able to like fulfill the demand. So I think that, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but it's just like it's ridiculous. And I think somebody said something here. So stewardship comes with activism as well, definitely. And I think that's also really important, right? Because even when it comes to like and you know, and I talk about healing a lot because that's the community that I'm a part of. It's like in the healing arts, like herbalism and like farming, and sometimes people, and I've seen this so much, right? Like it's just such an extractivist idea. Like there's this herbalist that lives around who loves to talk about, you know, like native plants and like invasive plants and like how to take care of the environment, but it's like never one mentions indigenous peoples, like, you know, like, and it's just so wild because it's definitely like about interconnection. Like how do we understand that we are all interconnected, and like it's beyond just, you know, like stewardship needs to be political. It needs to like come with like a political, like, you know, and like a privilege review of like what do we hold, what privilege we hold, what resources we hold that we can give up, or what, you know, what can we share with community, like how can we support communities that have been historically oppressed, right? So definitely. What are the actions you can take to back up your own ideologies? Yes. Oh, that's awesome. See, my family switched to turf. Exactly. I'm like, if you want to have lawn, like at least get some plastic turf and like call it a day. You know what I mean? Like that's probably gonna last for like a good amount of time if people really need to have green stuff. But even just also understanding that, and like something that, you know, like helped me a lot, because sometimes people would see my garden in LA and they'll be like, oh, this is a garden, like I thought it was gonna be like all orderly and whatever. And I was just like, no, I don't grow my stuff on lines. I don't overwater. I only water enough. And I'm not going to like be cutting dry plants, because those plants, like I'm not gonna throw those dry plants because those plants are gonna become soil, right? So even just the way that we think about gardens and farming, I think sometimes is very much like defined by like this European like farming and garden look, right? Like, you know, the rose gardens, or like, you know, whatever random European beliefs, like, even people hold in like, farming and gardening, which is like everything green, everything fresh, but like that doesn't make sense in Los Angeles. That doesn't make sense in New Mexico. And like, yeah, aesthetic standards versus sustainable reality. Exactly. Like, people having like huge lawns, like such a waste of water. Oh, and then the golf courses, of course. And it's always the rich people, right? And that's the thing too, that it's so wild because rich people are the most unsustainable thing, right? Like I think rich people need to just completely be like destroyed for us to even think about like a future, because their nonsense of golf courses and just like having green, like even here in like the high desert, like I've been in like like the richer areas of Albuquerque, and people just have lawns, and I'm like, how do you have lawns? Like we're in the desert, like that's not okay, that's not natural. Like plant some native trees, plant some native plants, like plant some cacti, like plant things that make sense. But it's definitely like the aesthetics that people want to hold on to. But yeah. And if anybody has any other questions or any comments that you want to make or add to that question that Rachel made.
Yeah, I had a question. My family is from like they're from like a deserty or like arid place as well, and I'm kind of curious like how you like sustainably like water like your things like in like a desert place, like if you have any
Yeah.
practices that you know of.
So there is a bunch of stuff. There is a book. Let me see. Give me 1 second. I'm actually going to show you that book because it's really cool. Give me 1 second. See. Oh goodness. I'm like, I want to find your fast, but it's not coming up. Yes, I'm really bad at remembering books' names, but it's like I really wish I need to add that here. It's um let me I'm gonna talk and I'm gonna see if I see it from here. But it's a book basically that's talking about the certification. I don't know if I'm saying that right. So basically the way that a lot of environmentalist scientists are thinking about the future is that there's going to be a lot of deserts. Oh, here it is. Give me 1 second. It's called Growing Food in Hotter, Drier Land, Lessons from Desert Farmers on Adapting to Climate Uncertainty. I'm gonna golf courses need to be abolished too. Yeah. Yes, I agree. I have friends that when they have the ground, I forget the ones that eat up your roots, the gophers, they catch the gophers and they take them to golf courses. Just like take all your pests to the golf courses. Growing food in hotter. And that's also why I moved here to the desert, because I was like, you know what? I need to learn how to grow food in extreme weather circumstances, because that's going to be the future. Like it's very much super uncertain. And we're going to have to be adapting, and the seeds that we're using have to be adapted to drier land, right? Drier landscapes. So this book is really awesome, and I really like that it has a bunch of pictures, and it talks about this guy who basically travels to different parts of Africa, the Middle East, Swana region, and like even the deserts here, like Chihuahua Desert, etc. And he actually shows you ways in which different farmers work with water catchments, like how to catch water, how to plant in a way that you are what's it called, using water correctly. So something that I've done, at least, I have planted a bunch of my trees, and so I make a hole and I plant. So this is like the ground level, and I kind of make a hole and I plant my trees right here, so that when there's rain or snow, or even when I'm watering, I'm able to just focus on that area, and that area gets flooded, but nothing else. So like the water is not leaving, right? It's just staying there. I'm using a lot of drip irrigation for all my stuff, which is great and also not great, because especially now with more conversations around like defending Israel and all that, and like Palestinian liberation, there is like basically drip irrigation. From what I've heard and from what I've read, which I have to like double triple check, but from what I read is that a lot of that pays taxes to like Israel. So it's complicated because it's a great system, that it allows you to drip irrigate specific plants, so you're not having a lot of like water loss. So you're using only enough to like water, that immediate part next to the plants, but also like politically, I don't know what that means. So I've tried to get all my stuff through donations. So I'm like, I'm not spending direct money on it, but it's kind of the same thing. Oh, this is perfect. It's a great example. I don't know if you can see that. So this is the tree. So I think this is higher up on the slope, and then they created like a little drainage situation that goes to other plants. So learning how to make waterways, right? So like seeing where you're at, how you're growing things, if there's water that water or snow or rain, like maybe how to create little channels so that you're making it so that the water is getting into the plants that you want to water, instead of just kind of like going everywhere. So just being more water conscious and creating those waterways. But this is a great book. This is a great book. It surprises me that they haven't come up with a course that isn't just one big water draining monoculture. And then Rachel says, my dad does that for the little trees. Definitely. Like people usually plant them in like, little holes. It just makes more sense. Also for the wind. So the wind doesn't like, just destroy them. Like you're kind of like planting them deeper in there. So like it has more protection from the wind. Yeah. I don't know if people have any last minute questions, or if we're good in time.
Yeah, I think we're just about at our stopping point, but Loba, thank you so much. I'm not sure if you know, but you were like the final speaker in our speaker series for this quarter. So thank you so much for that synthesis of everything that we've explored, all the topics that we've learned, and for your knowledge today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.